Welcome to another episode of MEPS International Speaking of Steel podcast. This time around, we'll be speaking about the rollout of the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU and the effect on the wider market. Once again, I'm joined by MEPS Head of Pricing and Forecasts, Kaye Ayub, and Market Analyst, Jonathan Carruthers-Green.
Hi.
Hi, John. Thanks for joining us again, Kaye. We'll get straight into the discussion. I think first off, we're sort of 10 months in now to the initial rollout phase of CBAM. John, what have been the key points on that timeline so far?
Yeah, CBAM and its transition phase has been here since October 2023. That was the first quarter that people had to start reporting the emissions. Since then, we've had we're now up to the reporting for Q2 of 2024, and as of July 31st, people had to have all their information submitted. There has been a slight change right now to the way that the scheme's being organised. So where we had default emission values were something that could be used. These were set up by the European Commission. We've now moved to a position where this can only be used for around about 20% of the actual emissions.
So what does that mean in terms of calculating those emissions? I imagine it's added a huge layer of complication.
Yeah. So as we're going through the sort of the CBAM scheme, it's getting more and more complicated. There's more and more administration that needs to be done. One of the things that the Commission tried to do to make it a little bit easier was to introduce these default values for each type of steel product. They'd put in an estimation which explained how much CO2 was being emitted for each ton of steel that was being produced. This was designed really to sort of give people sort of a starting point, and these were sort of based on sort of averages of averages, so they weren't particularly accurate. One of the main sort of ideas of this transition phase is to give people a chance to get some kind of scheme in place with their suppliers, so that they can actually get actual figures rather than these default figures. So as of this latest quarter, the amount that these default values can be used for is only 20% of a complex good, is what they call it. So something like iron and steel. That means that there's now the onus on the importers to get actual emissions data.
And I guess the onus is as much on the suppliers of that material as it is the importers themselves. How well equipped are they going to be?
Yeah, of course. It's really key that the importers and the suppliers develop that relationship where they can get this information, and it's going to be difficult. A lot of these companies haven't had to supply this kind of information before. There isn't any sort of legal requirement within their own country to supply this information, which is why there's been this time given for them to get this in place.
So, Kate, I'm conscious that you and the team of researchers at MEPS constantly hearing back from people in the market making those deals, trading steel across the world. So how difficult do they say it's been obtaining these emissions values, these accurate emission values they now need for CBAM?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the suppliers that, the importers or the buyers of steel from outside of Europe don't actually know what their actual emissions are. So they're, not necessarily able to supply that information just yet. So, and sometimes they don't necessarily want to or are able to, because it's sensitive information, really. So whether they will be able to really ever be able to supply that information is yet to be seen. So it's whether they will be able to continue with their current supplier relationship going forward with all of the suppliers that they currently buy from.
I guess it may be in certain scenarios that the actual supplier base that some importers use is based on the accuracy of the information on emissions.
Yeah. And that supply base may need to change in the future.
So, John, just to understand, this added layer of complexity is coming in. It's sort of been introduced quite heavily, actually, initially, this need for accurate data. How difficult has it been for importers so far? Has there been any complications in just the initial phase where they've been able to use those default values?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the main goals of this transition phase is to get this accurate data. So what's happening is they're slowly introducing these extra rules for the information that needs to be gathered, and what we're going to see from now on, like I say, is going to be 80% of that is supposed to be actual emissions data. We haven't had that so far. People have been very reliant on the default values. When the scheme was first introduced back in October, there was this big panic really to sort of understand what this all meant, and then the actual values that were supposed to be used weren't actually issued by the European Commission until the end of December. So it was very much a sort of a mad panic to sort of get a lot of this information in. What we also saw was there were some technical problems with the computer software that was used by the Commission to gather all this information. There was initially as an extension to the first reporting period. So they were supposed to have all that information in by the end of January. That soon got changed to the end of February. Since then, we've not had any further extensions. But as we're going from the easy easy sort of cop out way of using these default values, as that's been taken away, that support isn't there, and it really, the onus now is on the importers to get this accurate data.
Is there a chance at this stage then that there might be another one of those extensions so that people have got a little bit more time to get that accurate data in?
I don't think there'll necessarily be an extension in the same way there was previously. There may be some relaxation or informal relaxation of the rules. Once again, the idea of this period is pretty much a data gathering exercise. And while there are things like fines that could be in place, I think they're sort of meant more as a deterrent really than sort of being enforced at this stage.
And I find something that we could see at this stage, or where does that sit on the timeline?
I mean, potentially within the legislation that was that was produced, that there is a mechanism for fines to be applied, and these fines are all based on the amount of emissions that have gone unreported. So there's a euro value applied to each ton of emissions that isn't included within the paperwork. But once again, all the signs that we've seen, like I say, first of all in that legislation, and then secondly, sort of comments from commissioners, is that they're gonna try and hold off on applying these fines as much as possible. It's really not meant for people who are trying their best, who are trying to get this information in. It's more for people that are just ignoring the whole scheme altogether. And that's why they've sort of really ratcheted. They've really set a mechanism where they can ratchet these fines up, depending on how much you're complying with the measures and how much emissions you're not reporting.
Okay, John was talking there about the split between those that are really doing their best to comply and those who are perhaps ignoring the rules and trying to forge ahead as they were before. There's a big grey area, though, isn't there, somewhere in between? Do you get the impression at MEPS that people trading in steel across the globe are getting the support they need from the Commission? Is the process straightforward and transparent as it should be to allow them to complete these complex transactions now?
In terms of support, I mean, we don't really get many comments coming back about any lack of support as such. We get a lot of comments about how complicated the spreadsheet and the information that's required for the CBAM reporting phase, and whether what they need and where they need to put all the information is not necessarily always clear. So we get a lot of questions from people about, where they can find that help and where they can find the clarity on, which bits of the spreadsheet they need to fill in for their products, and the differences, between the different categories and things. So I think it's more that it's just been designed in an overly complicated way in their opinion. For instance, the UK CBAM version at the moment looks like it's perhaps slightly less complicated than the European one has been designed. Now, whether the UK government has perhaps learned a little bit from the European version, I don't know. But yeah, that's the main complaint we're getting back, is that the process seems to be overly complicated.
I've heard suggestions that whole departments have been set up. Not only have whole departments been set up, but there's an industry in terms of consultants coming in just to handle the CBAM documentation. Is that right?
Yeah, and we've also had, traders and big distributors who are importing, large amounts, that have also taken on staff specifically just to handle the reporting and the CBAM side of things. So although there's no specific costs at the moment for, importing any CBAM related costs, at least there is the staff costs associated with it, and also any consultancy costs that might arise if they need assistance or help, with filling all the information in. So there is at the moment an additional cost for CBAM for many companies.
I think that's something that's being picked up by the Commission as well. We've already heard some reports suggesting that they are going to review the rules to try and make it a little bit more simple to submit this information, as well as the scheduled revisions that have been planned in right from the start. They are now also looking to make give extra guidance and provide extra information on exactly how the scheme's set up, but then also to try and simplify that whole process altogether.
I mean, there is another sort of layer of complexity and potential cost, in the sense that we're now transitioning, am I right, John, from the existing ETS scheme into carbon cost moving forward. How's that going to be rolled out, and what does that mean exactly?
Yes, so the ETS scheme, the emissions trading scheme, is basically going to apply a carbon cost to European steel makers, and CBAM's sort of kind of designed to work alongside that. It's not necessarily supposed to be an import duty just to make it harder to import into the European Union. It's in the Commission's words, designed to sort of level the playing field. So what currently happens is these steel makers are given a certain free allocation of emissions that they are allowed to sort of surrender without any cost. And that's slowly going to be taken away over the next 10 years or so. And then in order to make CBAM sort of compliant with WTO regs, what they've had to do is introduce this CBAM charging at the same rate, essentially, as they're removing these free allocations for European steelmakers. So once again, I mean, the idea is that it's, while they're introducing this extra charge, it's going to be applied to everybody. And the ETS scheme will cover the European made steel, and the CBAM will cover the steel that's made outside the region.
So we are about to see some more complexity added in as well, which will affect, I guess, not only people importing material, but the suppliers themselves. And to a degree, I understand there's been criticism from various quarters, including government authorities themselves, on the rollout of CBAM so far. Are we likely to see, in light of that, any material changes to the process and the scheme that might assist its rollout going forward?
Yes. So we're really at the start of CBAM. This is the transitional phase before it sort of kicks in properly in 2026. And what we're going to see at January 2025 is another sort of slight amendment to the rules. So currently, the emissions values can be calculated in a couple of different manners. They could use a scheme that's sort of based. They could base the numbers on a scheme that's already existing potentially in one of the countries that's exporting into the EU. What will happen though is as of January 2025, it'll only be the CBAM compliant method that'll be accepted. So that'll be the next layer of sort of complexity that's going to be added. And then, like I say, that's going to go on until 2026. And from then on, that's when the actual charges for these emissions is going to be introduced. So it is going to get more complex. There is going to be more paperwork that needs to be done. There is going to be an actual financial cost introduced soon. But this is all with the goal of overall reducing carbon emissions within the steel industry.
Kaye's already alluded to the scheme that's going to be brought in from the UK. In reference to that, and I guess elsewhere in the world, are there other schemes similar to the EU CBAM that are in the offing? Are they going to start up? And I guess they're going to have to align in some respect, aren't they, to make life easy and ensure that the end goal is achieved, reducing emissions.
Yeah. I mean, there are already ETS style schemes in various countries around the world. China being one, which applies an emissions cost to its energy industry. South Korea, parts of the US, Canada have all got emissions style schemes. Perhaps a bit further along the line is here in the UK. We're actually planning on introducing a CBAM scheme ourselves from 2027. Now, the government released a paper, I think it was back in March 24, where they gave an outline of how they sort of saw the scheme. And as Kaye said, from my understanding of it, when I read through it, it did just seem a little bit simpler than the sort of the current EU scheme. There are a few more allowances for smaller imports. The way that the cost were added just seemed a little bit simpler, and it could be sort of calculated sort of once a year as opposed to having information once a quarter as we're currently doing. So that paper went into consultation. That ended in June 24, and we're currently waiting for the results. So everybody was invited to comment on that, and I expect there'll be some kind of amendments when that does get announced.
I'm right in thinking that there's a discrepancy in the timelines. I mean, UK is clearly slightly behind the EU.
Yeah. So what they're currently expecting is to introduce the UK CBAM from the start of 2027. So that is one year behind the EU scheme. And I say 1 year behind because they're not planning on having any kind of transitional phase where there's going to be just reporting requirements, but we're going to go straight into that point where these emissions would have to be paid for.
Right. Okay. And Kaye, is there some anticipation that in that year period between the EU scheme starting and the UK's equivalent scheme starting, that there might be an influence on the UK market? You can imagine imports in other parts of the world perhaps targeting the UK for that period.
I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, the UK have an import quota for imports from various countries anyway, so that will sort of give a little bit of a buffer, although they will come to an end in, is it June?
They're due to end sort of June 2026. So there's still that sort of 6-month period where potentially there's no protection for the UK.
So there'll be a 6-month period where they will be able to bring in imports unrestricted anyway, regardless of CBAM, without any quota volumes or limits effectively before that comes in. So they will become a target for imports anyway, I think. So
interesting. Watch this space on that front. Certainly,
yeah.
Sounds like it. John, what are the obvious advantages for European steelmakers and the industry in all this? Apart from the added paperwork, there's clearly something underlying all this that's going to help the industry in Europe?
Well, I think the goal of CBAM isn't to help European steelmakers. It's to reduce emissions within the steel industry as a whole. And as I say, with the ETS scheme, this increased cost is going to be applied to steel produced in the region, whereas the CBAM scheme is designed to apply that equally to imports coming into the EU, so that they're not unfairly advantaged or disadvantaged. In order to have the scheme be compliant and less likely to be challenged at the sort of the WTO level, they've got to do this. You can't sort of apply double taxation is sort of the common phrase. So they've carefully designed the CBAM scheme to reduce the likelihood of any challenges. However, we've already seen that certain countries are very likely to challenge this as soon as they can. A lot of the developing nations, for example, their argument is that they weren't involved in a lot of the emissions that have gone on historically. So why should they be charged additionally now for essentially something that was a problem that was created by the West? That's their sort of point of view. So I fully expect there to be challenges when this scheme kicks in fully.
Interesting. Okay, so Kaye, we've talked a lot about the added complexity and in some cases the added costs that are going to be incurred by the rollout of CBAM. Crucially for MEPS and its customers, what effect is there going to be on European pricing in particular?
Well, obviously, there's likely to be an upward trend on prices. Whenever you have an initiative like this, you get that extra cost coming in on imports, and that's likely to lead to mills putting their prices upwards. There's also going to be an additional cost for European producers as well. Their carbon allowances are going to be reduced over the years, so they're going to be paying more for their steel making. So they're going to need to pass that across onto their customers. So that it will push European steel making costs upwards, and as such, European steel prices upwards. However, we do expect that upward pressure will wane a little as well, because what you'll find is that the buyers will realign their purchasing supply routes, so they will find new lower cost supply to replace any higher carbon emitting supply routes that they're currently utilising, which will help to offset some of that higher steel prices in Europe. So they might buy from electric arc furnaces with lower carbon emitting, say in Turkey, for instance, or elsewhere, just to help bring down their average purchasing price. And the European mills will have to compete with that. So we do expect that we might see an initial spike in European prices when that initiative first is introduced, or perhaps as we're coming towards that. But then it'll come off a little bit, I think. So.
I guess while we're touching on the price implications, what effect will it have on the end user, you know, the manufacturers and the businesses that are making use of this steel ultimately?
Well, the CBAM initiative at the moment isn't including the downstream products. So, consumers will be able to import the finished products, your washing machines, your cars, without having to report for CBAM or to pay this carbon cost. So they're going to have to compete with potentially lower cost imports of finished goods. So what we might see is some of the manufacturing moved outside of Europe in order to avoid the CBAM for the steel that they're purchasing for the manufacturing, or we might just find that we'll have a two-tier pricing structure where if you're, as an end user, having to pay more for your goods that are manufactured here in Europe, and how much you would be willing to pay for that is another matter.
So, John, as Kaye's explaining there, it sounds like European manufacturing could actually be held back or disadvantaged by CBAM in its current form. Is that going to be allowed to continue?
Well, as it is, CBAM just covers these iron and steel products. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's this big concern that all we're going to do is we're going to reduce the emissions associated with those products, but we're just going to replace those with all of the material produced further downstream, produced elsewhere, and then imported into the EU. So there's that concern that manufacturing in Europe is going to be affected. The Commission, though, plans to extend CBAM. It's not just going to cover iron and steel. It's going to eventually cover much more of these products. So the intention is just to decarbonize the iron and steel industry, but it's to decarbonize entirely. But I think you also touched on another good point there, was that at the moment, while it just affects iron and steel, there's this concern that we're not going to actually reduce overall emissions, because what potentially could happen is, like you say, we could have electric arc producers supplying Europe, and sort of the dirtier blast furnace steel being sold elsewhere. So emissions don't actually get reduced at all. That's another one of the sort of criticisms that we see quite regularly.
A lot of scenarios to play out, a lot of potential impact on prices and supply going forwards. I think we'll leave it there, but we'll leave it with a message that, people really need to keep their eye on prices, on forecasts, to see how this story plays out in the longer term. Kaye, thanks again for joining us on the sofa. Thanks for your insight. It's been really enlightening. And John, thank you for all the detail of CBAM and what people can expect in the months to come. Thanks again for joining us for another episode of the MEPS Speaking of Steel podcast. We hope you'll join us again. In the meantime, if you do want to engage with us, address any questions that you might have about the content of the podcast, or even suggestions about what we might cover in the future, please do get in touch via podcasts@mepsinternational.com. Alternatively, you could just subscribe to one of our publications and make sure that you're guaranteed those insights on a monthly basis. Do subscribe to the podcast, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.